I looked out the window and saw a giant airplane coming straight toward me. I dove under my desk and covered my head with my arms. The impact was massive. The walls collapsed. I was trapped in debris. I prayed, "God, I can't do this. You take over now."
She was guiding people down the stairs, calm and steady, telling them to keep moving. She went back up to help more people and never came out again.
We're not ready to die. There's 3 of us in here. We're young men, not ready to die.
September 11th.
September 11th, the day that changed the world, is not just a historical recounting of a tragic day. It is a deeply human story of unimaginable loss, courage in the face of chaos, and the enduring impact on global history. The morning of September 11, 2001, began like any other in the United States. The sun rose over a peaceful sky, workers commuted into cities, children went to school, and the world spun in predictable rhythm. But by mid-morning, everything changed. At 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 slammed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City. Just 17 minutes later, United Airlines Flight 175 crashed into the South Tower. The world watched in horror as the 2 tallest buildings in New York crumbled into dust, killing thousands and scarring a city forever. Meanwhile, a 3rd hijacked plane struck the Pentagon, the nerve center of America's military operations, and a 4th, United Airlines Flight 93, crashed into a Pennsylvania field after passengers bravely fought back, preventing another devastating target from being hit. Nearly 30 people from more than 90 countries lost their lives that day. They were office workers, firefighters, police officers, pilots, passengers, and unsuspecting civilians. Each life lost carried a story, a family, dreams, and a future that was stolen in an instant. For those who survived, the memories remain etched in their hearts: the smell of burning steel, the cries in the stairwells, the chaos in the streets, and the haunting silence that followed the collapse. But September 11th was more than a singular moment of terror. It was the spark that ignited a new chapter in world affairs. The attacks led to the longest war in American history, fundamentally reshaped national security policies, and redefined global relations. The United States embarked on a war against terrorism that spanned continents, while citizens across the globe grappled with a new reality, one where fear and vigilance became part of daily life. This video aims to provide a comprehensive and respectful account of that day, examining it from multiple perspectives: the sequence of events, the stories of those who were there, the aftermath, and the legacy it left behind. Each episode delves into the minute-by-minute unfolding of events, piecing together how a meticulously planned attack shocked the world and forever altered the course of history. We will honor the heroism of first responders who ran toward danger, the strength of families who lost loved ones, and the resilience of a nation that refused to crumble. We will also explore the difficult questions that arose in the aftermath. How did it happen? Who was responsible? Could it have been prevented? And what lessons have we learned since? Whether you remember that day vividly, or were too young to understand its magnitude, September 11th, the day that changed the world, will take you through a journey of emotion, fact, and reflection. This is more than just history. It is the story of humanity at its darkest and most courageous hour. Prelude to tragedy. The calm before the storm. The morning of September 11, 2001, dawned with a sense of peace and normalcy that made what was about to unfold all the more shocking. Across the United States, millions of people woke up to what seemed like an ordinary Tuesday. The sky was clear and blue over the East Coast, the kind of early autumn day that felt crisp, fresh, and full of promise. In New York City, the streets bustled with commuters, tourists admired the skyline, and workers filled the elevators of the World Trade Center, unaware they were stepping into the final minutes of their lives. A nation going about its day. The United States was, in many ways, a country at ease. The 1990s had ended with relative peace and economic prosperity, while the new millennium had brought the usual anxieties of Y2K and a closely contested presidential election in 2000. Few Americans believed their homeland would ever experience a large-scale attack. Foreign threats felt distant wars happened in faraway lands. Not in the heart of New York or Washington, D.C. Air travel, too, reflected this confidence. Airport security was far less stringent than it would become in later years. Passengers could accompany loved ones to the gate, and ID checks were minimal. Cockpit doors were not fortified, and the notion of weaponizing airplanes as tools of terror was unthinkable to most. Yet behind this calm exterior, the gears of a deadly plan had been turning for years, a long-brewing storm. The seeds of September 11 were planted long before that fateful day. In the late 1990s, Osama bin Laden and his terrorist network, Al-Qaeda, had already carried out attacks against U.S. interests, including the 1,998 bombings of U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, and the 2,000 bombing of the USS Cole in Yemen. Intelligence agencies knew bin Laden posed a threat, but few grasped the full extent of his ambition or the sophistication of his network. In fact, the U.S. intelligence community had received multiple warnings, some vague, others chillingly specific, about possible attacks involving aircraft. But amid bureaucratic hurdles and a lack of coordination between agencies, these signals were not pieced together in time. The warnings, scattered like puzzle pieces, failed to create a clear picture until it was too late. Meanwhile, 19 hijackers, most of them from Saudi Arabia, had been preparing. Under the radar, they entered the United States, enrolled in flight schools, and blended into society. They took commercial flights to study aircraft operations, practiced martial arts, and followed meticulous plans crafted by Al-Qaeda leaders. To those around them, they were quiet, unassuming men. No one imagined that they would soon commit one of the most devastating acts of violence in modern history. The World Trade Center, a symbol of global power standing tall in Lower Manhattan, the World Trade Center complex was more than just a group of office buildings. To many, it symbolized the strength and global influence of the United States. Its twin towers, each 110 stories high, were architectural marvels that dominated the New York skyline. They housed financial firms, law offices, tech companies, restaurants, and a daily population of over 50 people. The towers had already survived one attack. In 1993, a truck bomb detonated in the underground garage of the North Tower, killing 6 and injuring over 1,000. The bombing, orchestrated by Islamic extremists, was meant to bring the building down. It failed, but it left a scare, a warning of what was possible. That warning would go unheeded in the years that followed. Inside the towers, life before impact. Inside the World Trade Center, the day began like any other. Elevators hummed, phones rang, and meetings were scheduled. Business professionals sipped coffee as they settled into their routines. On the observation deck of the South Tower, tourists snapped photos of the breathtaking view. At 8:00 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 took off from Boston's Logan International Airport, bound for Los Angeles. At 8:14, United Airlines Flight 175, also bound for Los Angeles, departed from the same airport. Unknown to passengers and crew, both flights had been hijacked shortly after takeoff. At this time, no one in New York or anywhere else in the country suspected that these flights had been overtaken by trained terrorists. The Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, had limited real-time tracking of commercial aircraft, and cockpit distress signals were rare in hijacking situations. Elsewhere, in America, as the hijacked planes flew toward their targets, Americans were dropping children off at school, driving to work, and tuning into morning talk shows. On Wall Street, the markets were preparing to open. In Washington, D.C., lawmakers were settling into their daily agenda. President George W. Bush was in Florida, preparing to read to children at an elementary school in Sarasota, visit intended to highlight education reform. The dissonance between this normalcy and the horror to come underscores why 9/11 was such a psychic rupture. It wasn't just the magnitude of the attack, but the fact that it occurred in the midst of the everyday. The violence was not confined to a battlefield. It unfolded on live television, in real time, with the world watching. An unimaginable threat, though. Intelligence officials had discussed the possibility of a major terrorist attack. Few believed hijacked planes would be used as missiles. The prevailing assumption was that hijackers would seek negotiation, hostages, or ransom, not suicide, and mass murder. The events of the coming hours would shatter these assumptions forever. Conclusion. The final moments of peace. By 8:30 a.m., the 4 hijacked planes were in the air. Unbeknownst to the passengers, the pilots had already been overpowered. The hijackers were steering the aircraft toward destruction with cold, terrifying precision. In offices, homes, and classrooms across America, people lived their last moments of innocence. Some were sipping coffee, others reading newspapers, unaware that history was about to shift beneath their feet. The final breath of calm before the storm lingered in the crisp morning air as the countdown to catastrophe neared its end. We will enter the moment the world changed forever when American Airlines Flight 11 struck the North Tower at 8:46 a.m., igniting panic, confusion, and horror that would ripple across the globe. A morning like no other. The first signs of horror at exactly 8:46 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time on a clear and serene Tuesday morning, American Airlines Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. The impact was immediate and devastating, tearing a massive hole through the upper floors of one of the tallest buildings in the world. In that instant, the ordinary became unimaginable. And for those in Lower Manhattan and the millions watching from a distance, the age of American invulnerability ended without warning. The first strike, Flight 11, had taken off from Boston at 7:59 a.m., bound for Los Angeles. On board were 92 people, 81 passengers, 9 crew members, and 5 hijackers. Shortly after takeoff, the hijackers, armed with box cutters and knives, seized control of the cockpit. The pilots were either killed or incapacitated. One flight attendant, Betty Ong, managed to make a calm yet chilling phone call to American Airlines operations, providing some of the first critical information that a hijacking was in progress. Her voice was steady, but her words carried a message of chaos and fear. The cockpit is not answering. Someone stabbed in business class. I think we're being hijacked. Flight 11 was turned south toward New York City. Air traffic controllers lost voice contact with the plane, but continued to monitor its flight path. As the jetliner approached Manhattan, its descent and trajectory puzzled air traffic controllers and eyewitnesses alike. Some thought it might be an accident, possibly a small plane off course. But when the massive Boeing 767 slammed into the North Tower at a speed of approximately 466 miles per hour, doubt vanished. The explosion was cataclysmic. A fireball erupted from the point of impact between the 93rd and 99th floors, instantly killing hundreds. Thousands more were trapped above and below the inferno. The building shuddered but remained standing, smoke billowing into the perfect blue sky. New York reacts. In the moments immediately after the crash, confusion reigned. News stations scrambled to cover the unfolding disaster. Camera crews rushed to the scene, and anchors speculated live on air about what had happened. Many assumed it had been an accidental, horrific, tragic error. The idea that this was a terrorist attack had not yet solidified in the public consciousness. People in nearby buildings stopped what they were doing and looked up. Office workers stood at windows in disbelief. Thousands flooded the streets, staring at the gaping hole in the North Tower. Sirens wailed as fire trucks, ambulances, and police cars raced toward the scene. The city's emergency response was swift and overwhelming, with units from all 5 boroughs converging on the World Trade Center. Inside the North Tower, chaos quickly escalated. Elevators had been severed by the explosion. Stairwells were filling with smoke. People above the impact zone were trapped with no escape. Phone calls began pouring out, some to 911, others to family members. Many of these calls were final goodbyes. Despite the horror, countless stories emerged of heroic security guards guiding people down the stairs, office workers helping the injured, strangers holding each other's hands in the dark. The South Tower, watches directly across from the North Tower, stood its twin, the South Tower. Workers inside had a direct view of the inferno. Some began evacuating on their own. Others waited for announcements, unsure whether they were in danger. The Port Authority made public address announcements advising people to remain in their offices unless instructed otherwise. Tragically, this guidance would cost lives. Air traffic controllers and military officials were now scrambling. Something was clearly very wrong, yet the full scope of the attack had not revealed itself. Then came the second strike. Flight 175, the world watches, in real time at 9:03 am, just 17 minutes after the first impact. United Airlines Flight 175 crashed into the South Tower. Unlike the first attack, this second collision was captured live on television. The entire world watched in real time as the massive aircraft banked and slammed into the tower between the 77th and 85th floors. The explosion was enormous. Glass, steel, and debris rained down on the streets below. There was no longer any doubt. This was not an accident. The United States was under attack. Flight 175 had also taken off from Boston at 8:14 a.m., also en route to Los Angeles. It carried 65 people, including 5 hijackers. Like Flight 11, its cockpit was overtaken within minutes. By the time air traffic controllers realized the plane had been hijacked, it was already on a collision course with Manhattan. The impact on the South Tower confirmed the unthinkable. Americans and the world were witnessing a coordinated act of mass terrorism on an unprecedented scale. The skyline of New York was on fire. 2 of its most iconic buildings turned into blazing tombs. The nation awakens. In Florida, President George W. Bush had just entered a second-grade classroom at Emma E. Booker Elementary School in Sarasota. Moments after the South Tower was struck, White House Chief of Staff Andrew Card leaned in and whispered, "A second plane has hit the second tower. America is under attack." Bush, maintaining composure, continued listening to the students read, but his face betrayed the weight of what he had just learned. Within minutes, the news had spread across the nation. Phones rang in offices and homes. Airports halted operations. Stock exchanges closed. In cities around the country, people stared at televisions in disbelief. Shock turned to fear, and fear turned to panic. Emergency response and evacuation. New York's first responders acted with incredible bravery. Firefighters, police officers, paramedics, and emergency workers ran toward the towers while thousands ran away. They ascended the stairwells of both buildings, trying to reach the trapped, not knowing if they would ever return. Many did not. As the scale of the catastrophe grew clearer, evacuations were ordered for both towers and surrounding buildings. Streets were clogged with people covered in ash and debris. Subways stopped running. Bridges and tunnels were closed. Cell phone service became erratic as networks were overwhelmed. Still, the full horror had yet to unfold. Airspace locked down. At 9:06 a.m., the Federal Aviation Administration halted all departures nationwide. At 9:21 a.m., the FAA ordered all aircraft in U.S. airspace to land at the nearest airport. It was the first time in history that American airspace had been completely shut down. Meanwhile, reports came in of additional hijacked planes. Rumors flew. Some said the White House was next, or the Capitol, or another major city. The sense of security that Americans had long taken for granted evaporated. By 9:30 a.m., the events of the morning had transformed into something beyond comprehension. What had started as an ordinary day was now the deadliest attack ever carried out on American soil. And the horror wasn't over. Within the next hour, 2 more planes would crash into the Pentagon, the other into a field in Pennsylvania. And before the morning ended, both towers would collapse, killing hundreds of first responders and thousands more. But in those early minutes, as smoke filled the air and sirens echoed through the canyons of Manhattan, the enormity of the situation had only begun to dawn on a shocked and grieving world. Flight 11, the attack on the North Tower. At 8:46 a.m. on September 11, 2001, American Airlines Flight 11 became the first weapon in a carefully orchestrated terrorist plot that would devastate the world. Its impact into the North Tower of the World Trade Center marked the beginning of an event that redefined modern history. We'll explore the complete timeline of Flight 11, its takeoff, hijacking, final moments, and the catastrophic consequences of its deadly trajectory. The flight that began it all, American Airlines Flight 11, was a Boeing 767 scheduled for a transcontinental flight from Boston's Logan International Airport to Los Angeles. On board were 92 individuals, 81 passengers, including the 5 hijackers, 9 crew members, and 2 pilots, Captain John Ogonowski and First Officer Thomas McGinnis. The plane took off at 7:59 a.m., with no initial signs that it would become part of one of the worst attacks in human history. The weather that day was clear, and the flight proceeded normally for the first 15 minutes. However, at approximately 8:14 a.m., the hijackers made their move. The hijacking. The 5 hijackers, Mohammed Atta, Abdulaziz al-Omari, Walid al-Shehri, Wael al-Shehri, and Satam al-Sukami, were seated in first class. Atta, who would later be identified as the ringleader of the 9/11 attacks, had been designated as the pilot for the operation. He and his accomplices used box cutters, small knives, and threats to overtake the flight crew and gain control of the cockpit. It's believed that Captain Ogonowski was either killed or incapacitated early in the hijacking, while Atta took the controls. The hijackers then turned off the plane's transponder, making it more difficult for air traffic controllers to track the flight's altitude and position. Inside the cabin, fear and confusion gripped the passengers and crew. Flight attendants Betty Ong and Amy Sweeney managed to place phone calls to American Airlines ground operations using onboard phones. These calls provided crucial early information about the hijacking. Ong reported stabbings in the business class section, the inability to contact the cockpit, and the erratic flight path. Sweeney's call was especially chilling. She described the attackers' use of knives, one passenger's throat being slashed, and the hijackers' calm demeanor. Her call ended abruptly at 8:44 a.m., just 2 minutes before impact. The approach to Manhattan. As Flight 11 turned southward toward New York City, air traffic controllers at the FAA's Boston Center lost voice contact with the aircraft. Controllers, increasingly alarmed by the flight's silence and deviation from its planned course, tried to regain contact. Then, at 8:24 a.m., they heard a chilling transmission over the radio. Mohammed Atta, speaking in broken English, mistakenly broadcast to air traffic control rather than to passengers. "We have some planes. Just stay quiet and you'll be okay. We are returning to the airport." This was one of the few direct pieces of evidence linking the hijackers to the coordinated attacks in real time. More disturbingly, Atta referred to some planes, suggesting a broader operation. But at the time, it was unclear how many other planes were involved. Flight 11 continued toward New York, flying dangerously low over the Hudson River. Witnesses on the ground saw the jet roaring above rooftops, headed directly for Lower Manhattan. It descended to an altitude of approximately 10 feet, a terrifying sight for those below. The impact, at exactly 8:46 a.m., Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center between floors 93 and 99 at a speed of roughly 466 mph. The impact was catastrophic. The plane entered the building at a slight angle, shearing through steel beams, office floors, and human lives. The fuel-laden aircraft created a massive explosion, igniting fires that would burn uncontrollably. Hundreds of people were killed instantly in the impact zone. Many more were trapped above it, cut off from any means of escape. The building swayed but remained standing. Glass shattered. Smoke poured out of gaping holes. Flaming debris rained down onto the streets. The fireball, visible from miles away, immediately drew the attention of news crews, civilians, and first responders. New Yorkers stood frozen in horror, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Inside the tower, panic erupted. The building's intercom system initially instructed occupants to stay at their desks, a recommendation based on previous fire protocols. Many who ignored this advice and began evacuating would survive. Tragically, others followed the instruction and perished when the tower later collapsed. Inside the North Tower, the impact zone spanned multiple floors, destroying structural support and cutting off stairwells. Dozens of people above the 99th floor attempted to find a way out, but smoke and fire consumed every passage. Desperate, many began making phone calls to loved ones or emergency services. On the floors below, workers fled through dark stairwells filled with smoke, water, and debris. Some were guided by emergency lights, others by instinct. Stories would later emerge of heroism individuals helping co-workers, carrying the injured, or directing others to safety despite their own injuries. The fire department quickly dispatched units to the scene. Battalion chiefs, firefighters, and medics entered the building, climbing the stairs with over 60 pounds of gear, fully aware that they might not come out. Some made it to the 30th floor and higher, coordinating rescue efforts and communicating with command centers on the ground. The view from the outside television networks quickly cut to live coverage of the North Tower in flames. Initially, most believed it was a tragic accident. Perhaps a small private plane had crashed. But as footage showed the size of the explosion and debris, speculation turned to something more sinister. People on the streets screamed and cried. Others simply stared up in disbelief. The clear blue sky, moments earlier a symbol of serenity, now served as a horrifying backdrop for destruction. The victims of the 92 people on board Flight 11, none survived. Inside the building, the death toll mounted. Hundreds were killed instantly. Many more would die from burns, smoke inhalation, or while attempting to escape. Some were trapped in elevators. Others were forced to make unthinkable decisions. In one of the most haunting images of 9/11, people began jumping from the upper floors driven by flames, smoke, and the knowledge that there was no way out. These individuals, often referred to as the jumpers, became tragic symbols of the desperation and horror inside the towers. The global shockwave begins. The attack on the North Tower marked the beginning of a new era. Within minutes, emergency operations centers across the country were activated. Military officials began formulating responses. The president was notified. Intelligence agencies raced to determine who was behind the attack. And then, at 9:03 a.m., a second plane, United Airlines Flight 175, struck the South Tower live on television. In that moment, the world realized that this was no accident. It was a coordinated assault on the United States. The first blow, Flight 11's impact, was not just physical, it was psychological, cultural, and emotional. It shattered illusions of security and ignited a war that would span decades. For those who perished, their stories became part of the enduring legacy of 9/11. And for those who survived, the memory of that morning would haunt them forever. We turn our attention to Flight 175 and the South Tower, where the attack became a global spectacle and the horror deepened. Flight 175, the South Tower struck. Just 17 minutes after the North Tower was hit, a second explosion rocked Lower Manhattan. At 9:03 a.m., United Airlines Flight 175 crashed into the South Tower of the World Trade Center, confirming what many feared but hadn't yet accepted. America was under coordinated attack. This second strike, captured live on television and witnessed by millions, transformed national shock into global horror. Flight 175 would become the moment the world realized the unimaginable was real, and it was far from over. The flight's journey. United Airlines Flight 175 was a scheduled flight from Boston's Logan International Airport to Los Angeles, a route nearly identical to that of Flight 11. The aircraft, a Boeing 767, carried 65 people on board, 56 passengers, including 5 hijackers, 2 pilots, and 7 crew members. Flight 175 departed at 8:14 a.m., slightly delayed but routine. The pilots, Captain Victor Saracini and First Officer Michael Horrocks, were experienced and respected. The skies were clear, and the flight path westward was uneventful until communication ceased, just after 8:42 a.m. Soon after takeoff, the 5 hijackers, Marwan al-Shehi, the pilot hijacker, Fayez Bani Hamid, Mohand al-Shehri, Hamza al-Ghamdi, and Ahmed al-Ghamdi sprang into action. The cockpit was stormed and taken over. Like Flight 11, the transponder was turned off, making the plane harder to track, but not invisible. By 8:47 a.m., just 1 minute after Flight 11 had struck the North Tower, Flight 175 had sharply veered off course. Controllers at the FAA's New York Center tried to re-establish contact, but the flight had gone silent. Chilling communications, Flight 175's flight attendants, like their counterparts on Flight 11, made phone calls that provided real-time details about the hijacking. Flight attendant Robert Fangman reported that the hijackers had knives and that the pilots were likely dead. Another attendant said one passenger had been stabbed and that hijackers had taken over the cockpit. Passenger Peter Hansen managed to make 2 phone calls to his father, relaying terrifying details. In his second call, just moments before the crash, he said, "It's getting bad, Dad. I think they intend to go to Chicago or hit a building. Don't worry, Dad. If it happens, it'll be very fast." His final words reflect the unimaginable horror and clarity that the victims experienced in those final moments. The impact, a second inferno. At exactly 9:03 a.m., Flight 175 crashed into the South Tower between the 77th and 85th floors, traveling at approximately 590 miles per hour. The impact was more direct and forceful than that of Flight 11. It struck at an angle that maximized structural damage and ignited a larger fireball due to the immense fuel on board. The moment of impact was broadcast live. Television stations, already covering the North Tower fire, had cameras trained on the Twin Towers. Viewers across the globe watched in real time as the jetliner approached and slammed into the second tower, erupting in flames and sending debris flying. It was a moment of collective disbelief and terror. The South Tower swayed violently but did not collapse. For now, it stood, consumed in flames and smoke, but the reality had set in. This was not an accident. It was an act of war. Inside the South Tower, unlike the North Tower, which had no warning, occupants in the South Tower had a crucial 17-minute window between the attacks. Many people had witnessed or heard about the first plane and began evacuating voluntarily, even before official instructions were given. Tragically, a public address system announcement after the first impact had advised occupants of the South Tower that their building was secure and that they could return to their offices. Many did, only to be caught in the blast when Flight 175 hit. The floors struck directly by the plane were obliterated. Those above were instantly trapped. The stairwells and elevators were destroyed. Fires raged upward, fed by jet fuel. Hundreds of people were killed instantly, while thousands more were left scrambling in darkness and chaos. Emergency responders had already begun entering the South Tower after the first plane hit the North Tower. When the second crash occurred, many firefighters and police officers shifted their focus to the newly impacted building, racing against time to save lives. Eyewitnesses and the nation react. The second impact transformed confusion into certainty. This was a planned, orchestrated assault on American soil. The images of Flight 175's crash played over and over again on television, shocking viewers into a new reality. People across New York screamed, wept, or fled as flaming debris and body parts fell from the sky. First responders struggled to manage the growing crowd of victims and panicked civilians. The streets of Manhattan turned gray with ash and fear. Journalists, anchors, and commentators strained to remain composed were visibly shaken. Some gasped on live air. Others were speechless. The phrase, "America is under attack," began to circulate with heavy gravity. President George W. Bush, still at the elementary school in Sarasota, Florida, was informed of the second strike while sitting with schoolchildren. His face froze. He remained seated for several minutes before being escorted to a secure location. The United States government moved swiftly into emergency protocols. Air defense systems were activated. The military was placed on high alert. Fighter jets were scrambled. The scene inside and out. The conditions inside the South Tower were deteriorating rapidly. Survivors in lower floors made their way down crowded stairwells, some carrying the injured, some guiding strangers. But for those trapped above the 85th floor, there was no escape. Like the North Tower, people began jumping from windows, some alone, others holding hands. These were acts of desperation, an effort to escape the unbearable heat and smoke. Outside, Manhattan resembled a war zone. Ambulances formed triage centers. Police officers helped direct crowds and cordon off buildings. Construction workers, office staff, and complete strangers formed makeshift rescue teams. The humanity that emerged amid the devastation was powerful. Technical and structural damage. Flight 175's angle and speed created enormous structural damage. The aircraft severed the building's core columns and ignited jet fuel that poured down elevator shafts and stairwells. Engineers and emergency services began realizing that the buildings might not hold. The South Tower had taken a more forceful hit than the North. With compromised steel beams, widespread fires, and a critical blow to its structure, the building was now a ticking time bomb. The world realizes the truth. By the time Flight 175 struck the South Tower, any hope that the first crash was an accident had evaporated. News agencies began calling the events acts of terrorism. The names Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden started surfacing, although no group had claimed responsibility yet. World leaders responded within minutes. Condolences and support poured in from Europe, Asia, and beyond. The entire globe had seen the second plane hit. The attack had transcended borders. It was now a global tragedy. A turning point. The crash of United Airlines Flight 175 was the moment the world awakened. It turned a moment of confusion into a moment of understanding, devastating and horrifying as it was. The second strike confirmed that the nightmare unfolding was no accident, but a meticulously planned attack designed to kill, shock, and terrorize. And yet, as the smoke poured from both towers and sirens screamed through the streets, no one could yet grasp what was still to come. At 9:37 a.m., another plane, Flight 77, would slam into the Pentagon. And at 9:59 a.m., the South Tower, weakened and burning, would begin its catastrophic collapse. We shift our focus to the chaos and panic in New York City, as both towers burn and the city begins to crumble under the weight of the horror. Panic and chaos. New York under siege. At 9:03 a.m., the second plane struck the South Tower of the World Trade Center, and in that moment, the psychological dam that held the city's sense of safety collapsed. The disbelief of the first attack gave way to the realization that America was facing a coordinated and catastrophic assault. New York City, one of the most vibrant and resilient cities in the world, descended into panic, confusion, and utter chaos. A city in shock. In the minutes following the second impact, Lower Manhattan became a scene unlike anything witnessed in American history. People ran screaming through the streets, some covered in soot and blood, others clutching cell phones, trying desperately to reach loved ones. Civilians and emergency responders alike were struck with the dawning horror that these building symbols of American economic power had become death traps. Many had witnessed the second plane hit in real time. Office workers and bystanders along Wall Street and Battery Park screamed and pointed skyward as the fireball consumed the South Tower's upper floors. Pieces of the aircraft and building rained down. Glass shattered. Alarms echoed through the streets. Those who had calmly watched the North Tower burn now fled in fear. Across the bridges and rooftops of Brooklyn, Queens, and New Jersey, people stood frozen, staring at the smoke columns climbing into the sky. The city's heartbeat had shifted from bustling to terrified in a matter of moments. Inside the towers, the race to escape. Inside both towers, thousands of people were attempting to evacuate. Some were running down the stairs, others helping co-workers or guiding the injured. Many floors were pitch black, filled with smoke. The stairwells, while still intact in lower floors, were clogged with people, some crying, others silent in shock. Fire alarms blared. Intercoms delivered instructions that were often conflicting or outdated. In the North Tower, the situation was worse. Because it had been the first hit, and higher up in the building, more people were trapped above the impact zone. In the South Tower, some managed to escape, thanks to the crucial 17-minute window before it was hit. For many, those 17 minutes made the difference between life and death. Firefighters and police officers climbed floor after floor with heavy equipment, oxygen tanks, and hoses. Most knew they were walking into near certain danger, but they continued anyway. Entire units of firefighters would perish that day, many making it to the upper floors before the towers collapsed. On the streets, terror and heroism outside. Lower Manhattan was a war zone. Emergency vehicles clogged the streets. Paramedics treated the wounded on sidewalks. Stunned survivors wandered aimlessly, some bleeding, others coated in a gray, ghostly layer of dust and ash. Debris landed on cars and buildings. The acrid smell of jet fuel and smoke filled the air. Yet amid the chaos, acts of incredible bravery and compassion unfolded. Strangers helped strangers. Business owners opened their doors to provide water, shelter, and phones. Volunteers emerged from every direction. First responders triaged patients with what little supplies they had. Civilians directed traffic to clear paths for emergency vehicles. In the darkest of moments, humanity flickered, but no one knew what was coming next. The collapse of the South Tower. At 9:59 a.m., the South Tower began to buckle. From the outside, a strange groaning sound was heard as steel beams gave way under the intense heat of the fires. Inside, the structure's core collapsed, and the floors pancaked downward at nearly free-fall speed. In less than 10 seconds, the 110-story building vanished into a massive, billowing cloud of dust and debris. The collapse sent a shockwave through the city. A monstrous plume of gray dust shot through the narrow streets, engulfing cars, people, and buildings. Reporters and news crews ran for cover as the skyline disappeared behind a wall of smoke. People fled blindly, some tripping, others dragging those who couldn't run. It was like a volcanic eruption in the middle of a city. Those caught in the collapse zone were buried under tons of debris. Many died instantly, others survived in small pockets of air, trapped beneath rubble. Emergency responders, many already inside the building, were crushed. Nearly 10 people, including firemen and paramedics, perished in the South Tower, collapse alone. Across the city, panic surged. Was the North Tower next? Were more planes coming? Rumors swirled of bombs, of secondary attacks, of other buildings being targeted. The city was paralyzed by fear. Mass exodus and uncertainty with subways shut down, tunnels and bridges closed, and air traffic grounded. Manhattan became an island of terror. Tens of thousands of people began walking uptown or across bridges on foot, desperate to escape. People wept openly as they walked. Some carried coworkers on their backs. Others pushed strangers in wheelchairs. Many simply moved forward in stunned silence, too shocked to speak. Emergency broadcast systems instructed citizens to stay away from Lower Manhattan, while public transportation halted entirely. Businesses shuttered, schools locked down, hospitals prepared for mass casualties only to later realize that most of the wounded had not survived. Communications. Breakdown telecommunications infrastructure was overwhelmed. Cell towers collapsed or were rendered useless due to volume. Emergency lines were jammed. The city's Emergency Operations Center, based in 7 World Trade Center, had to be evacuated. Coordination among rescue teams became increasingly difficult. Families across the city and country were desperate for news. Phones rang endlessly. Many waited for hours, days, or longer before learning if their loved ones were safe or gone. The emotional toll, amid the ash and smoke, grief settled in. People clung to photographs, searching hospitals, calling every number they could find. Missing posters began appearing on walls and fences. Loved ones gathered at churches, community centers, and firehouses, desperate for information. Clergy, social workers, and counselors rushed to the front lines. City officials gave press conferences from hastily set up locations, their faces weary and hollow. The mayor of New York, Rudy Giuliani, would famously declare, "The number of casualties will be more than any of us can bear." It was an understatement. A global epicenter of grief, New York City had faced disasters before: blizzards, blackouts, even terrorist attacks like the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. But nothing prepared the city for this. The loss was immense. The skyline, permanently altered. The people, forever changed. Yet even as smoke continued to rise from ground zero, the city began to adapt. Makeshift triage centers became crisis coordination zones. Volunteers formed bucket brigades to dig through rubble. Firefighters refused to leave without finding their brothers. New Yorkers opened their homes to the displaced. Blood banks were overwhelmed with donors. Food and supplies poured in from across the nation. In the midst of terror, resilience took root. The heart of a city shattered. In the span of 2 hours, New York City transformed from a thriving metropolis to a city under siege. The attacks didn't just damage steel and concrete, they fractured the collective psyche of a nation. Lower Manhattan, the heart of global finance and culture, was now a burial ground, covered in ash and grief. But in the chaos, the people of New York showed the world something else: strength, defiance, unity. And though the dust had not yet settled, it was clear New York would never forget this day. Nor would the world. We will shift our focus to Flight 77 and the Pentagon, where the third plane would bring war to the heart of America's military power. Flight 77 and the Pentagon. The nation's military heart hit. While chaos reigned in New York City, another tragedy was unfolding in Washington, D.C. At 9:37 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77 crashed into the west side of the Pentagon, the headquarters of the United States Department of Defense. The attack brought the horror of September 11th directly to the seat of American military power, sending shockwaves through the Capitol and further confirming the calculated nature of the assault. The Pentagon, a symbol of strength and security, had been struck at its core. The flight path of Flight 77. American Airlines Flight 77 departed from Washington Dulles International Airport at 8:20 a.m., bound for Los Angeles. On board were 64 people, 58 passengers, including 5 hijackers and 6 crew members. The aircraft, a Boeing 757, was under the command of Captain Charles Burlingame, a former Navy pilot, and First Officer David Charlebois. For the first 30 minutes of the flight, everything seemed normal. Then, at approximately 8:51 a.m., the plane's transponder was turned off, and communication with air traffic control ceased. At 8:54 a.m., Flight 77 veered dramatically off course, turning south and then looping back east in the direction of Washington, D.C. By 9:00 a.m., the Federal Aviation Administration had begun to suspect that Flight 77 was another hijacked aircraft. The situation had escalated rapidly with the earlier attacks on the World Trade Center. Still, no one knew where this third hijacked plane was heading or how imminent the threat had become. The hijackers. The 5 hijackers on Flight 77 were Nawaf al-Hazmi, Khalid al-Mihadar, Majid Moked, Salem al-Hazmi, and Hani Hanjour. Hanjour, the designated pilot, had attended flight school in the United States, though instructors had questioned his ability to handle a commercial airliner. Nonetheless, he was at the controls as the plane turned toward the nation's capital. The hijackers had used the same tactics as those on the earlier flights: knives, box cutters, and physical force. Some passengers and crew were likely killed or incapacitated early. Barbara Olson, a well-known television commentator and wife of U.S. Solicitor General Theodore Olson, managed to make 2 phone calls from the plane, reporting that the hijackers had moved passengers to the back and taken control of the cockpit. Her final words gave one of the few first-hand accounts from inside Flight 77, a direct hit on the Pentagon. At 9:37 a.m., Flight 77, traveling at roughly 530 miles per hour, slammed into the western side of the Pentagon. The impact created a massive explosion, piercing 3 of the building's 5 concentric rings and igniting a fireball fueled by thousands of gallons of jet fuel. The damage was catastrophic. The plane obliterated support columns and offices, causing a section of the building to collapse shortly after impact. Flames spread rapidly through the corridors. Thick black smoke billowed into the sky as the nation's most secure military facility turned into a scene of chaos and destruction. Among the 64 people on board, there were no survivors. On the ground, 125 Pentagon personnel, military, and civilian were killed, bringing the total death toll from the crash to 189. The targeted symbolism. Unlike the World Trade Center, which symbolized global economic power, the Pentagon was the heart of U.S. military strategy. It was designed during World War II to be resilient and efficient, capable of withstanding significant force. Its 5 sides, vast corridors, and central courtyard made it one of the largest office buildings in the world. But on this day, its symbolism became a target. The attack was intended not only to cause death, but to strike fear into the heart of American power. The choice of the Pentagon demonstrated the strategic precision of al-Qaeda's planning, attacking Not just buildings, but ideas. Freedom, defense, and national pride. Inside the Pentagon, fire and rescue. In the seconds after the crash, chaos erupted inside the Pentagon. Fire alarms blared, ceilings collapsed, and smoke filled the hallways. Some survivors were blown from their chairs by the explosion's force. Others, stunned and wounded, crawled through the darkness in search of safety. Within minutes, military personnel, security officers, and nearby workers became first responders. They dragged the injured from flames, kicked down doors, and formed human chains to guide people through the smoke. Many ignored their own injuries to help others. Arlington County Fire Department, along with units from surrounding jurisdictions, rushed to the scene. Fighting the fire proved immensely difficult due to the building's size and structure, the intensity of the flames, and the risk of further collapse. Nonetheless, rescue workers managed to save dozens of lives in the hours that followed. Washington in crisis. In the nation's capital, the panic was immediate. As news spread of the attack on the Pentagon, evacuations began across government buildings, including the White House, the Capitol, and federal agencies. Police blocked off streets. Airspace was shut down. Military jets scrambled overhead. For many, the attack on the Pentagon felt even more personal than those in New York. It was a strike against the very heart of American defense and the capital of the free world. Rumors flew. Was the White House next? The Capitol? Another plane was still unaccounted for later, revealed to be Flight 93. President George W. Bush, having just addressed the nation from Florida, was ushered onto Air Force One under heavy security. Vice President Dick Cheney was taken to a secure underground bunker. The entire country was placed on the highest state of alert. Witnesses and the aftermath witnesses described seeing a low-flying plane approaching from the southwest, barely above the highway, before slamming into the Pentagon. Drivers on nearby roads were stunned by the sight. Some pulled over, some ran from their vehicles, others instinctively reached for their phones to call loved ones or emergency services. In the hours following the crash, thick black smoke continued to rise from the Pentagon. The image of the world's most powerful military headquarters in flames was both surreal and devastating. Rescue and recovery operations were complicated by the ongoing threat of additional attacks and structural instability. Flags across Washington were lowered, churches filled with people in prayer, blood donation lines wrapped around buildings. In the face of fear, Americans began to respond with unity. The scale of the loss among the dead were decorated military officers, civilian contractors, administrative workers, and airline passengers. They were mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, and children. Some had served their country for decades. Others were on their way to meetings or beginning a normal workday. Their lives were taken in an instant. The attack on the Pentagon also marked a turning point in the day's psychological toll. It proved that the threat was nationwide, that no place, not even the heart of American defense, was safe. The heart of power struck. The crash of Flight 77 into the Pentagon completed the terrifying triangle of 9/11. New York City, the nation's financial heart. Washington, D.C., its political and military core. And soon, a rural field in Pennsylvania, where Flight 93 would be brought down by courageous passengers who refused to let evil triumph. For the American people, the Pentagon attack underscored that the assault wasn't just symbolic, it was real, violent, and lethal. It tore open the illusion of invulnerability, but it also revealed the courage of those who responded: soldiers, civilians, firefighters, and medics who risked their lives to save others amid the smoke and flames. We tell the remarkable story of Flight 93, where everyday Americans became heroes and made a selfless choice that may have saved hundreds, if not thousands, of lives. Heroes on Flight 93, the plane that fought back. Of all the tragic flights on September 11th, United Airlines Flight 93 stands out as a story of unimaginable courage. While 3 other planes reached their deadly destinations, Flight 93 was the only one that did not. It didn't miss because of luck, it missed because of the bravery of ordinary people who made an extraordinary decision. With no military background, no weapons, and no time, a group of passengers confronted hijackers, took action, and changed history. This is their story. The flight begins United Airlines Flight 93 was a domestic flight scheduled to travel from Newark International Airport in New Jersey to San Francisco, California. It took off late 8:42 a.m. after a 40-minute delay due to airport congestion. That delay, insignificant at first glance, would prove critical. On board were 44 individuals, 37 passengers, 7 crew members, and 4 hijackers. The aircraft was a Boeing 757. Among the passengers were business professionals, retirees, college students, and vacationers, people from all walks of life. None had any idea that they would soon face a decision that would test the limits of human courage. The hijackers. The 4 hijackers on board were Ziad Jarrah, the pilot hijacker, Ahmed al-Haznawi, Ahmed al-Nami, and Saeed al-Ghamdi. Jarrah, a Lebanese national, was a trained pilot with a history of living in Germany and attending U.S. flight schools. Of the 19 terrorists involved in 9/11, he was considered the most westernized and perhaps the most conflicted. Unlike the other 3 planes, Flight 93's hijackers waited longer to act. At approximately 9:28 a.m., after 2 of the World Trade Center attacks had already occurred, and just minutes before the Pentagon strike, they made their move. They stormed the cockpit, attacked the pilots, and took control of the aircraft. Passengers in the cabin heard screams and the sound of violence through the closed cockpit door. Some called the cockpit, others tried to calm those around them. Then, the plane turned sharply, changing course and heading toward Washington, D.C. What the hijackers didn't know was that, because of their delay, the passengers already knew what was happening elsewhere. The phone calls that changed everything. Unlike passengers on the earlier flights, those aboard Flight 93 had time to learn about the other attacks. Using onboard airphones and cell phones, several passengers called family members, friends, and emergency services. Through these conversations, they learned that the World Trade Center and the Pentagon had both been attacked by hijacked planes. This changed everything. They realized their plane was part of the same plot. It was no longer a hijacking in the traditional sense, it was a suicide mission, and they were headed toward a target that, while unknown, was almost certainly symbolic. Intelligence officials and later investigations suggest it may have been the White House or the U.S. Capitol. Realizing this, the passengers made a decision. They would not allow the plane to be used as a weapon. Planning the revolt within minutes, a plan formed. Passengers including Todd Beamer, Tom Burnett, Jeremy Glick, Mark Bingham, and others coordinated a response. Some were athletes, others had military or self-defense experience. They gathered intelligence from the phone calls, assessed the hijackers' behavior, and braced for a counterattack. Todd Beamer, in a now famous call with a phone operator named Lisa Jefferson, recited the Lord's Prayer and 23rd Psalm. His final words, just before he and the others stormed the cockpit, would become a rallying cry for a grieving nation. Are you guys ready? Okay, let's roll. Armed with nothing but boiling water from the galley, a food cart, and sheer determination, the group charged the cockpit. The hijackers, startled and unprepared for resistance, attempted to maneuver the plane erratically. The cockpit voice recorder captured a chaotic scene, shouting, banging, alarms. The passengers were fighting for control. The final moments. The black box recordings, later recovered from the wreckage, revealed the final seconds. The passengers breached the cockpit door, and a physical struggle ensued. The hijackers screamed in panic. One asked, "Shall we finish it?" And another responded, "Yes, pull it down." At 10:03 a.m., United Airlines Flight 93 crashed into a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, at over 560 miles per hour, nose first and upside down. The plane disintegrated on impact, creating a crater 15 feet deep and scattering debris over acres of farmland. All 44 people on board were killed instantly, but countless lives were saved. The hijackers never reached their intended target. The passengers' revolt likely prevented an attack on the U.S. Capitol or the White House, both symbols of American democracy. The crash site first responders arriving at the scene were stunned. Unlike the dense urban chaos of New York or the massive structure of the Pentagon, the Shanksville crash site was eerily quiet. Smoke rose from a smoldering crater. There were no survivors, no recognizable wreckage. The impact had vaporized the plane. Local residents, farmers, and volunteers rushed to help, but there was little they could do. Instead, they bore witness to one of the most courageous acts of 9/11. Over time, the site would become hallowed ground, a place where valor and sacrifice overcame hatred. The legacy of Flight 93. The actions of the passengers and crew aboard Flight 93 represent one of the most powerful stories of unity and heroism in modern history. They were civilian sun-trained, outnumbered, and unarmed. Yet they chose to resist, to fight back, to sacrifice themselves for the greater good. In doing so, they may have saved the heart of the American government, and they offered a glimmer of hope on a day otherwise defined by destruction. Memorials were quickly planned. The crash site in Shanksville became a national memorial, honoring the bravery and selflessness of those aboard. Family members of the victims became powerful voices for remembrance, resilience, and peace. Presidents, political leaders, and citizens alike have paid tribute to Flight 93. Their story is often told as the moment the victims of 9/11 became combatants choosing agency in the face of death and refusing to be passive victims. A nation-inspired Flight 93 story became a symbol of American resolve. In the aftermath of the attacks, "Let's Roll" was adopted as a national motto. Schools, parks, and highways were named after the passengers. Books, films, and documentaries retold their courage for future generations. But most importantly, their actions reminded the world that even in the darkest hour, there is light. Even in the face of terror, there is strength. The plane that fought back United Airlines. Flight 93 was never meant to be a battleground, but in its final minutes, it became only a battle fought not with guns or armies, but with unity, courage, and love. The passengers aboard didn't just save lives, they changed the narrative of the day. They proved that even against impossible odds, ordinary people can make extraordinary choices. We returned to New York, where at 10:28 a.m., the unthinkable happened. The North Tower collapsed, marking one of the deadliest moments in American history. Collapse. The Twin Towers fall. In the span of just 102 minutes, the iconic Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, symbols of American prosperity and modern engineering, were reduced to rubble. Their collapse was sudden, violent, and nearly incomprehensible. For those on the ground and the millions watching on television around the world, it marked a turning point from tragedy to cataclysm. This chapter recounts the final moments of the towers, the harrowing stories of survival, and the overwhelming devastation that followed. A ticking clock by 9:03 a.m., both towers had been struck. The North Tower burned from the 93rd to the 99th floors, while the South Tower blazed between the 77th and 85. Jet fuel, ignited upon impact, poured down elevator shafts and stairwells, spreading fire throughout multiple floors. Temperatures inside the buildings reached upwards of 1,800°F, 980°C, weakening steel supports and infrastructure. Structural engineers watching from afar grew increasingly concerned. Though the towers had been built to withstand the impact of a commercial airliner, they were not designed to endure fires of this intensity. The building's cores and outer columns were compromised. As each minute passed, the load-bearing structures grew closer to failure. Thousands were still inside, evacuating through narrow stairwells or trapped above the impact zones. Emergency personnel were climbing higher, attempting to reach those in danger. Many never returned. Then, at 9:59 a.m., without warning, the South Tower began to fall. The collapse of the South Tower from the street. A rumble was heard deep and growing louder. The upper floors of the South Tower began to tilt and then gave way. In under 10 seconds, the 110-story building collapsed straight down in a roaring plume of dust and debris. It was like watching a mountain fall. The collapse generated a seismic event equivalent to a 2.1 magnitude earthquake. A pyroclastic cloud of ash, pulverized concrete, glass, and steel swept through the streets at over 60 miles per hour. Survivors described the sound as thunderous, like a freight train crashing down from the sky. People ran for their lives. Some were overtaken by the dust and debris, temporarily blinded and gasping for air. Firefighters, police officers, journalists, and civilians were thrown to the ground. Entire city blocks disappeared behind a wall of gray. For those in the North Tower and surrounding buildings, the collapse of the South Tower deepened the terror. Many didn't know which building had fallen. Rumors swirled. Communications failed. People began to realize that the North Tower might soon follow. The final stand of the North Tower. Inside the North Tower, conditions were rapidly deteriorating. The impact zone was already impassable. Fires were spreading. Emergency responders, many unaware of the South Tower's collapse due to radio communication issues, continued their rescue operations. Firefighters climbed stairwell B, the only stairwell that remained intact, carrying gear and providing aid. Despite the chaos, a sense of duty and courage prevailed. In the lobby, fire department commanders tried to regroup and strategize. Outside, evacuation continued, but progress was slow. The stairways were congested. Injured people needed assistance. Some evacuees didn't make it in time. At 10:28 a.m., 29 minutes after the South Tower's fall, the North Tower also collapsed. The collapse of the North Tower. The top of the building began to sag, then plummeted. As with the South Tower, the upper floors pancaked downward with terrifying speed. Steel gave way. Floors compressed. The building disintegrated from the top down, blanketing the city in dust and ash. The second collapse sent a second shockwave through Manhattan and through the hearts of all who watched. The entire World Trade Center complex had now vanished. First responders, civilians, and media members who had rushed to the scene were now running from it. One fire chief who had just arrived yelled into his radio, "The second one's gone! The second one's gone!" Others screamed for backup, unaware that most units had already been buried under the rubble. The second cloud enveloped the city, darkening the sky and rendering much of lower Manhattan unrecognizable, buried beneath the towers. In the aftermath of both collapses, a section of stairwell B in the North Tower remained intact, saving the lives of 14 people, including a group of firefighters, a Port Authority officer, and a civilian. They would later become known as the Miracle Survivors. But most who remained inside the buildings did not survive. The combined collapse of both towers killed nearly 700 people. Hundreds of firefighters and police officers were buried beneath the wreckage. Some victims were never found, their remains vaporized or lost in the pulverized layers of concrete, steel, and dust. In the minutes after the collapse, rescue teams began clawing through debris with their bare hands. Calls for silence were issued as workers listened for voices. Whistles, tapping, and faint cries occasionally pierced the silence. But as the hours passed, the number of rescues dwindled. The site became known as Ground Zero, a city paralyzed. The collapse of the towers brought New York City to a standstill. Bridges, tunnels, and subways remained shut down. Emergency vehicles couldn't navigate debris-filled streets. Hospitals waited for patients that never came. The magnitude of the loss was becoming clear. Few had survived the upper floors of the collapse. Citizens helped one another walk uptown, away from the devastation. Strangers shared bottled water, makeshift masks, and encouragement. Volunteers set up triage centers and supply stations. In a city known for its fast pace and independence, community and compassion took center stage. But grief hung heavy in the air. The national response across the United States, Americans watched in horror. Schools were closed. Airports remained shut. Military bases were locked down. All commercial flights were grounded. First in U.S. history, fighter jets patrolled the skies. President George W. Bush, speaking later that day, called the attacks evil, despicable acts of terror. He pledged that America would defend freedom and bring those responsible to justice. The president's words, delivered with uncharacteristic gravity, marked the beginning of what would become the War on Terror. World leaders, regardless of ideology, expressed sympathy and solidarity. France declared, "We are all Americans now." Global landmarks lit up in red, white, and blue. But beneath the speeches and candles, an undeniable sense of vulnerability had settled in. The loss and the rubble. The collapse of the Twin Towers left behind 1.8 million tons of debris. Rescue workers, many of whom would later face severe health issues from toxic exposure, toiled day and night to search for survivors. They found very few. Families gathered at hospitals, churches, and eventually, Ground Zero, clutching photographs of loved ones, praying for miracles. Missing posters filled every surface walls, telephone poles, subway stations. Hope persisted for days, but reality could not be delayed forever. The Twin Towers were gone, and with them, thousands of souls, including emergency responders who had rushed in without hesitation. A skyline lost, a nation changed. The fall of the Twin Towers was not just the collapse of buildings, it was the collapse of a sense of safety, of the belief that America was untouchable. The skyline of New York was forever altered, and so too was the psyche of a generation. Yet in the devastation, stories of courage, unity, and sacrifice emerged. Firefighters, police officers, office workers, and ordinary citizens became heroes. The dust would settle, but their memory would never fade. We honor the first responders, those who ran toward danger, many of whom never returned, and whose bravery remains a lasting legacy of 9/11. First responders, bravery amid the rubble. In the darkest moments of September 11, 2001, amid chaos, fire, and collapsing towers, a group of individuals ran toward danger when everyone else fled. There were firefighters, paramedics, police officers, EMTs, and other emergency personnel, many of whom never made it home. Their acts of bravery and self-sacrifice became a defining image of that day, a powerful testament to human courage and the unbreakable spirit of service. The first to arrive. The first emergency calls were made seconds after American Airlines Flight 11 struck the North Tower at 8:46 a.m. Within minutes, the New York City Fire Department, FDNY, New York Police Department, NYPD, Port Authority Police Department, PAPD, and emergency medical teams had begun mobilizing. Chief Joseph Pfeiffer of FDNY's Battalion 1 was among the first on the scene. His unit had been out investigating a gas leak nearby and saw the plane hit with their own eyes. His calm yet urgent voice can be heard on early dispatch recordings as he ordered a full first alarm response. He would survive, but many of the men under his command would not. As responders poured into Lower Manhattan, a command post was set up in the lobby of the North Tower. Firefighters in full gear began climbing stairwells, some reaching as high as the 78th floor before the buildings came down. The elevators had been disabled, and the only way up was on foot. Carrying hoses, oxygen tanks, tools, and emergency gear, these responders climbed into hell with unwavering resolve. Firefighters, the climb into history. The FDNY suffered the most devastating loss in its history that day. 343 firefighters were killed. Many firehouses lost nearly their entire company. Some sent in every available unit, including senior officers and chiefs, knowing the risks. They climbed relentlessly, floor after floor, helping injured civilians, providing direction in smoke-filled stairwells, and carrying the incapacitated. Their courage was matched only by their humility. They made calls to loved ones from the lobby, leaving brief messages. Others passed civilians on the way up and offered words of comfort. One survivor remembered a firefighter saying simply, "Don't worry, lady, we'll get you out." Some were last seen in stairwells. Others were heard on radio transmissions, giving final updates before the signal went silent. They didn't hesitate. They didn't turn back. They gave everything. Police and Port Authority officers, guarding the people alongside the firefighters, members of the NYPD and PPD performed vital, heroic roles. They helped evacuate thousands of people, directed civilians through smoke-filled concourses, and coordinated crowd control amid a rapidly deteriorating situation. 71 law enforcement officers died in the line of duty on 9/11, 23 NYPD officers, 37 PAPD officers, and 11 others from various agencies. Many were last seen escorting people down stairwells, staying behind to guide the injured, or manning radio relays to maintain communication with the outside world. One of the most famous stories of courage was that of PAPD officer Moira Smith, the only female police officer to die that day. She was credited with leading countless civilians to safety before returning into the building for more. She died when the South Tower collapsed. Another story is that of Officer John McLaughlin and Officer Will Jimeno, who were trapped in the rubble of the South Tower for hours before being rescued. Their survival, dramatized in the film World Trade Center, is one of the rare miracles of that day. Emergency medical services. Treating the impossible EMS personnel were also among the first responders, setting up triage stations and treating the wounded with limited resources and chaotic conditions. Many worked without regard for their own safety, often remaining in position even as the building showed signs of instability. Ambulances lined the streets, stretchers, supplies, and medical teams crowded corners of lower Manhattan. But, despite their readiness, the expected surge of survivors never came. Most had perished in the towers or under the rubble. Still, they stayed. They treated firefighters for burns, gave CPR to civilians pulled from the debris, and comforted the dying. Volunteers and civilian heroes. As the scale of the disaster became clear, ordinary citizens joined the first responders. Construction workers brought tools and generators. Off-duty paramedics, nurses, and doctors ran to ground zero. Civilians handed out water, carried the injured, and formed makeshift rescue teams. One man, Rick Rescorla, head of security at Morgan Stanley in the South Tower, had trained employees for years to evacuate efficiently in the event of an emergency. On 9/11, he led thousands out, singing to keep them calm. He went back in to help more and was never seen again. These unsung heroes, janitors, security guards, elevator operators, saved lives. Their stories, often overshadowed, are no less heroic. After the collapse, rescue and recovery. When the towers fell, it buried thousands under 1.8 million tons of debris. The aftermath was a surreal landscape of smoke, twisted metal, ash, and silence. Many assumed there were no survivors, but still, first responders dug. They climbed unstable piles of rubble, risking collapse with every step. In the days that followed, the rescue mission became a recovery operation, yet the responders refused to stop searching. They used dogs, sound equipment, bare hands, anything that might lead them to signs of life. The air was toxic, thick with pulverized concrete, asbestos, and chemicals. Many responders inhaled this dust without masks, working around the clock. Years later, thousands would develop chronic illnesses, cancers, and respiratory diseases because of that exposure. Honoring the fallen funerals began within days of the attack, and they continued for months. Firehouses draped in black bunting became shrines. Bagpipes echoed through city streets. Families mourned their loved ones, and an entire nation grieved the loss of those who died trying to save others. September 11th reshaped how America saw its first responders, not just as public servants, but as heroes. Their sacrifice became etched into the country's collective memory. Memorials were built. Names were engraved in bronze. Foundations were created to support the families left behind. But for those who survived, the weight of loss never lifted. The living legacy, the heroism of the first responders, lives on, not just in monuments or documentaries, but in every life they saved, every person they comforted, every family they gave hope to. Legislation such as the James Zadroga 9/11 Health and Compensation Act, named after an NYPD officer who died from illness linked to Ground Zero exposure, was passed to ensure continued medical coverage for 9/11 responders and survivors. Today, firefighters, officers, and EMTs still visit schools to tell their stories. Recruits learn about those who came before them, and every September 11th, at Ground Zero, a bell tolls for the fallen. Bravery in the face of darkness. On a day defined by destruction, the actions of the first responders provided a shining contrast. They were the embodiment of duty, compassion, and sacrifice. In stairwells and lobbies, on streets and in rubble, they fought to save lives while risking their own. They did not ask for recognition. They did not pause to calculate the odds. They simply acted because it was their job, because others needed help, because they believed in something greater than fear. Their bravery remains one of the most enduring legacies of September 11th. we will hear from the survivors themselves, their harrowing escapes, impossible choices, and the strength it took to live through the deadliest day in modern American history. Survivor stories. Moments of hope and loss. While September 11, 2001 is often remembered through images of collapse and chaos, it is also a day marked by resilience. In the midst of unimaginable terror, thousands of people survived, each carrying with them a story of courage, heartbreak, and the human will to live. We will share the voices of those who survived, offering personal glimpses of the moments when hope flickered in the darkness and the narrow paths between death and survival were found. The stairwells. Escape from the towers. The Twin Towers housed over 14,000 people at the time of the attacks. Despite the devastation, more than 90% of those below the impact zone survived, largely because of rapid evacuation and instinct. Stanley Premnath, an employee of Fuji Bank, was working on the 81st floor of the South Tower when he saw United Airlines Flight 175 heading straight for him. He dove under his desk as the plane crashed into the building. Trapped behind debris, he called out until Brian Clark, an executive from a neighboring company, heard his cries. The two men, complete strangers, helped each other find a way through the rubble and down the stairs. They were among the last people to escape from above the impact zone before the building collapsed. Their story became one of the most well-known examples of mutual aid. Two men, from different floors, races, and backgrounds, surviving together through trust, courage, and quick thinking. Choosing to leave, a decision that saved lives. Some survivors escaped because they acted quickly, even in the absence of official instructions. After the North Tower was hit, announcements in the South Tower advised occupants to stay at their desks. Many heeded the advice, but some trusted their instincts and evacuated immediately. Rick Rescorla, head of security for Morgan Stanley, had long prepared for a potential terrorist attack. His frequent evacuation drills were mocked by some employees, but on 9/11 they saved lives. After the North Tower was hit, Rescorla began calmly directing more than 500 Morgan Stanley employees down the stairs. He sang songs over a bullhorn to keep them calm. Nearly all of them survived. Rescorla went back up to help others. He was last seen on the 10th floor. He did not survive, but the people he guided out of the tower carried his memory with them. His actions became a blueprint for emergency preparedness and the power of calm leadership. Narrow escapes. Minutes and inches from death. Survival on 9/11 often came down to mere seconds or random chance. Janelle Guzman McMillan, a Port Authority clerk, was on the 64th floor of the North Tower when it was hit. She and her colleagues tried to evacuate, but the stairwell became jammed. After the South Tower collapsed, they stopped to rest just one floor above the lobby. Moments later, the North Tower began to fall. Guzman was buried under debris, but survived in a pocket of air. For 27 hours, she remained trapped, unable to move, praying for rescue. She was the last person pulled alive from the rubble. Rescuers found her only because a firefighter named Paul noticed her red-painted nails sticking out from the debris. Her story became one of the most miraculous survivals of the day, and a symbol of hope in the days that followed. Evacuation through smoke and fear. For those in lower floors, escaping still wasn't easy. Thick smoke, confusion, and lack of communication made evacuation terrifying. Ron DeFrancesco, one of the last people to escape from above the 91st floor of the South Tower, recalled being knocked unconscious during the impact. When he awoke, he forced himself up and began descending. The stairwells were dark and filled with smoke. He ran past flames and falling debris, emerging from the building just before it collapsed behind him. His injuries were extensive, but he survived. He later said he believed he was guided by a mysterious voice, something spiritual, that encouraged him to keep going when he felt he could go no farther. Elevator survival. Elevator systems in the Twin Towers failed catastrophically during the attacks. Many elevators were severed or burned by jet fuel, trapping people inside. Frank De Martini, Pablo Ortiz, and other construction managers working for the Port Authority helped pry open jammed elevator doors and lead dozens of people to safety before they themselves were killed in the collapse. Their actions saved countless lives on the upper floors of the North Tower. Those who survived elevator traps did so by sheer luck or by quick intervention from others. Their experiences were among the most claustrophobic and terrifying of the day. on the streets, witnessing collapse. Many survivors weren't inside the towers but were caught nearby when they fell. Marcy Borders, a legal assistant, was photographed fleeing the North Tower collapse, her entire body coated in gray ash. The haunting image, later known as the Dust Lady, became one of the most enduring symbols of the human toll. Though she survived, Borders suffered from severe PTSD and later health complications due to dust exposure. For others, simply being in Lower Manhattan became a struggle to breathe, see, or escape. People fled through darkened subway tunnels, dodged falling debris, and tried to outrun the clouds of ash that enveloped the city. Their survival was chaotic, instinctual, and deeply traumatic. The survivor's guilt. For many who lived through 9/11, survival came with a price guilt. Why did they survive when their coworkers didn't? Why did they take the stairs, or leave early, or miss a meeting, while others perished? This psychological weight, known as survivor's guilt, became a common theme in the years following the attacks. Therapy and support groups helped some, but for others, the pain lingered. "I walked past people in the hallway," one survivor said. "I told them it was safe. I didn't know. I still see their faces." Survivors became the bearers of stories, both their own and those of the fallen. Many dedicate their lives to sharing what happened, educating future generations, and ensuring that those lost are never forgotten. Acts of humanity and kindness. In the midst of terror, humanity prevailed. Strangers carried the injured. A man shared his asthma inhaler with a struggling coworker. Someone gave away his shoes to help a barefoot woman flee the scene. Another man led a blind coworker down 70 flights of stairs, refusing to leave him behind. These small, quiet acts of heroism filled the day, proving that in the worst of times, people can rise to their best. Carriers of memory. The survivors of September 11 are not only witnesses, they are living memorials. Through them, we learn not just about what happened, but about what it felt like, what it meant, and how deeply it changed the world. Their stories remind us that life is fragile, that decisions matter, and that courage comes in many forms. Whether they crawled through rubble, descended a burning stairwell, or simply followed a gut instinct to flee, their choices save lives and their voices keep history alive. We'll explore how the rest of the world responded, examining the global shockwaves that reverberated from New York, Washington, and Shanksville into every nation on Earth. Global shockwaves. The world reacts. The attacks of September 11, 2001 were not only an assault on the United States, they reverberated across the globe, shaking the foundations of international politics, security, and human consciousness. As the Twin Towers crumbled and the Pentagon burned, the world watched in stunned silence. The tragedy unfolded live on television and radio, broadcasting pain, chaos, and fear into homes, offices, schools, and communities in every corner of the earth. What followed was an unprecedented moment of global unity, grief, and reflection. In this chapter, we examine how the world responded in the immediate aftermath and how the events of that day reshaped global relationships, attitudes, and alliances. The world watches in real time. Because of time zones, the attacks occurred during the middle of the day in Europe, late afternoon in parts of Asia and the Middle East, and evening in Australia. Offices across the globe halted operations as employees gathered around televisions or radios. Breaking news alerts interrupted regularly scheduled programming. Headlines in every language began appearing within minutes. In London, Paris, Berlin, Tokyo, Johannesburg, São Paulo, and Sydney, people stared in disbelief. They watched live as United Airlines Flight 175 struck the South Tower, broadcast in real time, and as both towers fell, many believed they were witnessing a fictional disaster movie. The scale was so vast, the imagery so surreal, that the line between reality and nightmare blurred. International stock markets dropped. Airports across the world went on high alert. Borders tightened. Embassies and consulates increased their security. And people everywhere asked the same question: why? Global mourning. A planet united in grief. In the days following the attacks, a rare moment of global solidarity emerged. Countries across the world lowered their flags to half-staff. Vigils were held in public squares. Candles were lit in front of US embassies. Churches, mosques, temples, and synagogues held prayer services for the victims. In London, thousands gathered in Trafalgar Square for a moment of silence. In Moscow, Russian citizens laid flowers outside the US embassy. In Tehran, Iran, often politically opposed to the US, held a spontaneous candlelight vigil where citizens mourned for American lives. World leaders offered condolences and unwavering support. French newspaper Le Monde famously ran a headline on September 12 that read, "Nous sommes tous Américains." We are all Americans. NATO, for the first time in its history, invoked Article 5, declaring that an attack on one member was an attack on all. This opened the door for a global coalition to take part in America's response. A surge of international support. Within hours, dozens of governments pledged assistance. Canada opened its airports to dozens of diverted flights, taking in thousands of stranded passengers. Communities like Gander, Newfoundland, suddenly found themselves housing and feeding entire planeloads of people, acts of kindness that would become legendary. Queen Elizabeth II, addressing the British people, said, "Grief is the price we pay for love." Vladimir Putin, then president of Russia, offered full cooperation. Even adversarial countries like Libya, Syria, and China condemned the attacks and expressed sympathy. The United Nations passed a resolution condemning terrorism and calling for international cooperation. The global community recognized that terrorism was not a regional problem, it was a global threat that demanded a collective response. In the Islamic world, a complex reaction. The reaction in Muslim majority countries was more complex, nuanced, and often misunderstood by Western media. While extremist groups praised the attacks, the overwhelming majority of Muslims were horrified. Many Islamic leaders condemned the violence outright, emphasizing that the attacks violated core teachings of Islam. In Cairo, Jakarta, and Istanbul, religious leaders held public services to denounce terrorism and pray for the victims. In Pakistan, a country frequently caught between extremist ideologies and Western alliances, candlelight vigils were held, and officials declared support for the US. In the coming conflict, still, suspicion, fear, and Islamophobia surged globally. In many countries, Muslim citizens faced increased discrimination and hostility, even as they mourned alongside everyone else. A new, complicated chapter had begun in global cultural relations zone that would take decades to fully understand and heal. International media and public sentiment newspapers across the world ran stark, black headlines. America attacked. A new day of infamy. Terror hits the heart of the free world. Editorials expressed solidarity, but also fear. Would this happen elsewhere? Who was behind it? Was anyone safe? Ordinary citizens responded with compassion. In Tokyo, strangers left flowers outside the American embassy. In Dublin, churches rang their bells in mourning. In Paris, thousands left handwritten notes at Place de la Concorde. It was one of the rare times in modern history when the entire world grieved together, not just for the American victims, but for the recognition of shared vulnerability and loss. The shift in global security policy. The ripple effects of 9/11 extended far beyond sympathy. Governments around the world began to reevaluate national security, immigration, intelligence sharing, and anti-terrorism measures. Airport security changed overnight. Metal detectors became standard. Liquids were restricted. Full-body scanners and biometric IDs were introduced. International travel would never be the same. Intelligence agencies expanded cooperation across borders. Countries that once viewed each other with suspicion began sharing data, tracking extremists, and strengthening counterterrorism units. The attacks led directly to the US, led invasion of Afghanistan, but it was supported by a coalition of over 40 nations. NATO allies, including the UK, Canada, Germany, and Australia, deployed troops. It became one of the largest international military campaigns in modern history. Economic impact across borders. The financial world felt the tremors immediately. Stock markets plummeted. Insurance companies faced historic payouts. Airlines suffered crippling losses. The global economy, already fragile in places, was thrown into uncertainty. Supply chains were interrupted. Consumer confidence dropped. Tourism faltered. Nations began allocating billions toward homeland security, military operations, and counterterrorism initiatives. But the economic impact wasn't just monetary. It shifted global priorities. Where once globalization and trade had dominated the conversation, now security and surveillance took center stage. Cultural and psychological ripples. Beyond policy, the attacks changed how people thought and felt. In countries far from the US, citizens began to view terrorism as a personal threat. Cities like London, Madrid, Mumbai, and Bali would later suffer their own terrorist attacks in the years that follow, events directly or indirectly inspired by the precedent set on 9/11. Filmmakers, artists, writers, and musicians around the world responded. Films were delayed or re-edited. Songs were written in tribute. Novels explored grief, memory, and trauma on a global scale. The collective psyche of the world had shifted. Life felt more uncertain, more vulnerable, more interconnected, for better and for worse. A day that changed everyone. September 11th, 2001, may have begun as an American tragedy, but it quickly became a global one. The horror transcended borders, politics, and culture. In the rubble of New York and Washington, the world saw its own reflection, its fragility, its fears, its humanity. In the unity that followed, there was a glimpse of what the world could be: compassionate, cooperative, resilient. But in the fear and division that also took root, the road ahead would prove long and complex. We will follow the path of investigation and justice. The United States uncovered the perpetrators, pursued Al-Qaeda, and began a global war on terror that would shape the 21st century. The hunt for the culprits. Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. In the immediate aftermath of the September 11 attacks, the world demanded answers. Who had carried out such an elaborate, brutal operation? How had they planned it so meticulously, and why? As the dust settled, the United States began one of the most extensive investigations in history, quickly identifying the perpetrators and setting the stage for a global manhunt that would dominate international affairs for years to come. We'll see how the US discovered the identities of the hijackers, tracked their connections to Al-Qaeda, and began the hunt for Osama bin Laden, the world's most wanted man. Initial investigation. Connecting the dots. Within hours of the attacks, American intelligence agencies launched a full-scale investigation. The FBI, CIA, NSA, and other agencies scrambled to examine flight manifests, passport records, immigration documents, phone calls, financial transactions, and surveillance footage. Early leads came from the planes themselves. Although the black boxes from the Twin Towers were destroyed, flight reservations and boarding logs provided key information. It was soon determined that 19 hijackers were involved, 5 on each of the 4 planes, except for Flight 93, which had 4. Most of the hijackers were from Saudi Arabia, with others from Egypt, Lebanon, and the United Arab Emirates. They had entered the United States legally using tourist or student visas. Some had lived in the US for over a year. Several had attended American flight schools in Florida and Arizona. Their names, Mohammed Atta, Marwan al-Sheikhi, Ziad Jarrah, among others, quickly became known. Within 2 days, the FBI released photos of all 19 hijackers, along with details of their aliases, flight itineraries, and known contacts. All roads lead to Al-Qaeda. As investigators followed the evidence, a pattern began to emerge. The operation bore the hallmarks of a known terrorist organization, Al-Qaeda, an Islamist extremist group founded by Osama bin Laden in the late 1980s. Al-Qaeda, meaning the base in Arabic, had been growing for over a decade. Initially formed during the Soviet-Afghan War, the group evolved into a global network of jihadists bent on expelling Western influence from Muslim countries and establishing a strict Islamic caliphate. Osama bin Laden, the son of a wealthy Saudi construction magnate, had transformed Al-Qaeda into an ideological and logistical force. He issued fatwas, religious decrees calling for attacks on Americans, whom he saw as occupiers of Muslim lands, particularly after the Gulf War. When U.S. troops were stationed in Saudi Arabia, bin Laden had previously orchestrated or funded several attacks on U.S. targets, including the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, the 1998 U.S. embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania, the 2000 attack on the USS Cole in Yemen. Despite growing evidence of his threat, bin Laden had eluded capture. After being expelled from Saudi Arabia, he relocated to Sudan, then Afghanistan, where he found sanctuary under the Taliban regime. Intelligence failures and missed warnings. While the investigation quickly zeroed in on al-Qaeda, it also uncovered a series of intelligence failures that allowed the attacks to happen. Several of the hijackers had been flagged by various intelligence agencies in the years prior to 9/11. For example, the CIA had tracked Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi, two of the hijackers on Flight 77, but failed to alert immigration authorities when they entered the U.S. FBI field agents had raised concerns about foreign nationals taking flight lessons, particularly Zacharias Moussaoui, a French-Moroccan man arrested in August 2001. His suspicious behavior led to inquiries, but a search warrant was denied due to insufficient evidence. A subsequent report by the 9/11 Commission, published in 2004, concluded that the attacks were a result of a failure of imagination. The agencies had the puzzle pieces, but they weren't assembled in time. Public naming of bin Laden. On September 20, 2001, President George W. Bush, in an address to a joint session of Congress and the American people, stated unequivocally, "Our war on terror begins with al-Qaeda, but it does not end there." He named Osama bin Laden as the chief suspect and demanded that the Taliban government of Afghanistan hand him over. When they refused, citing lack of evidence and offering conditional negotiations, the U.S. prepared for war. The al-Qaeda network. By now, intelligence agencies had mapped out much of al-Qaeda's structure. It was not a traditional hierarchical organization, but rather a decentralized network with operatives and sympathizers in over 60 countries. It used safe houses, couriers, charitable organizations, and coded communications to operate in secrecy. Al-Qaeda's training camps in Afghanistan were instrumental in preparing operatives not just for 9/11, but for future global attacks. Investigators also uncovered the role of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, a Pakistani national who had presented the 9/11 plot to bin Laden in 1996. He would later be identified as the mastermind behind the attacks. The money trail also led back to al-Qaeda. The operation cost an estimated $400 to $500, largely funded through wire transfers, fake charities, and personal couriers. The hijackers lived modestly in the U.S., avoiding attention while planning the deadliest terrorist attack in history. The global response. The war on terror begins. With al-Qaeda identified as the culprit, the U.S. launched Operation Enduring Freedom on October 7, 2001. It began with targeted airstrikes against Taliban and al-Qaeda positions in Afghanistan, marking the start of what would become America's longest war. Other countries joined the effort. NATO allies invoked Article 5 and sent troops. Pakistan, under pressure, agreed to assist the U.S. by allowing the use of airspace and intelligence sharing. The Northern Alliance, an Afghan resistance group opposed to the Taliban, coordinated with American forces on the ground. By December 2001, the Taliban regime had collapsed, but bin Laden remained elusive. Bin Laden's escape from Tora Bora. In December 2001, intelligence pinpointed bin Laden's location in the Tora Bora Mountains near the Pakistan-Afghanistan border. U.S. forces, along with Afghan allies, launched a massive assault. Despite heavy bombing and an intensive ground search, bin Laden escaped, possibly through mountain trails into Pakistan. Critics later argued that the U.S. should have committed more troops to Tora Bora or sealed the border more aggressively. The failure to capture bin Laden at this crucial moment would haunt American strategy for years. Al-Qaeda regroups. Even as its sanctuary in Afghanistan collapsed, Al-Qaeda survived. Its leadership scattered into Pakistan, Iran, Yemen, and other countries. Smaller, affiliated groups began to emerge, including Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, AQIM, Jama'a Islamiyah in Southeast Asia. These groups carried out bombings in Bali, 2002, Madrid, 2004, and London, 2005, all claiming allegiance to bin Laden's ideology. The world had entered a new era of asymmetrical warfare, where small groups with radical beliefs could inflict massive harm. The face of terror revealed. The investigation into 9/11 quickly revealed a chilling truth. The attack was not an isolated act, but the product of a sophisticated, well-funded, and deeply motivated terrorist network, led by a man who had declared war on the West years earlier. Al-Qaeda's name became synonymous with global terror. Osama bin Laden became the world's most wanted man, and the United States, along with much of the world, had entered into a prolonged struggle not just against individuals, but against an ideology. We will explore the beginnings of this struggle, the war on terror, its promises, its challenges, and the ways it would reshape geopolitics, civil liberties, and the lives of millions of people around the world. The War on Terror, a new global era. In the wake of the September 11 attacks, the United States and its allies embarked on a mission that would redefine the 21st century. Branded the War on Terror, this global campaign was more than a military response. It was a political, legal, ideological, and cultural shift. It reshaped global alliances, restructured national security, influenced domestic policy, and led to wars, surveillance systems, and debates that continue to this day. We will examine how the War on Terror began, the countries and individuals it targeted, the domestic changes it triggered, and its complex legacy, marked by both strategic victories and deep controversies. Declaring war on terrorism on September 20, 2001, President George W. Bush, in an address before a joint session of Congress, laid the foundation for the War on Terror. Our war on terror begins with Al-Qaeda, but it does not end there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated. This was not a war against a nation, it was a war against a network, an ideology, and a method of violence. It had no defined borders, and it offered no clear timeline. The objective: dismantle terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda, prevent future attacks, and confront state sponsors of terrorism. Phase 1. Afghanistan. Operation Enduring Freedom. The first battleground was Afghanistan, where the Taliban government had provided sanctuary to Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. On October 7, 2001, the United States and United Kingdom launched Operation Enduring Freedom. The military strategy combined airstrikes, special operations, and local alliances with Afghan resistance groups like the Northern Alliance. Within weeks, the Taliban regime began to fall. Kabul was retaken by Afghan forces in November, and by December, Taliban leaders had fled or gone underground. Al-Qaeda training camps were destroyed, and many operatives were killed or captured. But the key figure Osama bin Laden escaped at Tora Bora, vanishing into the tribal regions of Pakistan. The US pledged to rebuild Afghanistan, establish democracy, and eliminate terrorist threats. But what began as a targeted operation would evolve into a 20-year military occupation, making it America's longest war. The Patriot Act and Homeland Security. The War on Terror wasn't limited to overseas combat. It transformed the American home front. Just weeks after the attacks, Congress passed the USA Patriot Act, uniting and strengthening America by providing appropriate tools required to intercept and obstruct terrorism. It expanded the powers of law enforcement and intelligence agencies to conduct warrantless surveillance, monitor financial transactions, detain and deport suspected terrorists, share information between agencies. While supporters argued the act was essential for national security, critics warned it eroded civil liberties. Concerns over government overreach, racial profiling, and privacy violations became prominent issues in the years that followed. In 2002, the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, was created to consolidate 22 federal agencies, becoming the third largest department in the U.S. government. Its mission was to prevent terrorist attacks, respond to national disasters, and protect U.S. infrastructure. Airports introduced the TSA, Transportation Security Administration, which brought new screening procedures, no-fly lists, and enhanced passenger scrutiny changes that remain in place to this day. Phase 2. Iraq. A controversial expansion. In 2003, the War on Terror expanded dramatically and controversially with the invasion of Iraq. The Bush administration claimed that Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, and had ties to Al-Qaeda. Though Saddam had a history of defying UN weapons inspectors and committing human rights abuses, the alleged connection to 9/11 was tenuous at best. On March 20, 2003, US and coalition forces invaded Iraq. Baghdad fell within weeks. Saddam Hussein was captured later that year and eventually executed after trial. However, no WMDs were found. The intelligence used to justify the war was discredited. The invasion led to widespread insurgency, sectarian violence, and the rise of extremist groups, most notably ISIS, Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. The war in Iraq divided the international community. Many allies refused to participate. Protests erupted globally. The US faced criticism for unilateral action and for underestimating the complexities of post-war governance. The Iraq War would cost thousands of American lives, over 100 Iraqi civilian deaths, and trillions of dollars, casting a long shadow over the broader war on terror. Global impact and alliances. The war on terror wasn't America's alone. Nations around the world joined the fight in various forms. United Kingdom, Canada, Germany, Australia, and others sent troops to Afghanistan. Pakistan became a key, if complicated, ally, receiving billions in aid while also serving as a haven for extremists. NATO redefined its role, expanding its presence beyond Europe. Counterterrorism laws were passed across Europe, Southeast Asia, and Africa, but global support came with conditions. Guantanamo Bay, the U.S. military prison in Cuba, where detainees were held without trial and subjected to harsh interrogation techniques, became a symbol of legal and moral controversy. Extraordinary rendition, black sites, and enhanced interrogation, widely regarded as torture, led to international condemnation and accusations of human rights violations. A new kind of enemy: lone wolves and radicalized youth. As Al-Qaeda's central leadership weakened, the threat shifted. Homegrown terrorism and lone wolf attackers, individuals radicalized online or through local networks, became the focus of intelligence agencies. Attacks like the 2005 London bombings, the 2008 Mumbai attacks, the 2015 Paris attacks, and the 2016 Brussels bombings demonstrated that terrorism was evolving. Social media and encrypted communication platforms allowed extremist ideologies to spread rapidly. Groups like ISIS mastered online propaganda, recruiting fighters from Europe, Asia, and the Americas. The battlefield was no longer just physical, it was digital, ideological, and psychological. The war's human cost. The war on terror has had immense human consequences. Over 7 U.S. military deaths in Afghanistan and Iraq. More than 50 wounded veterans. Millions of civilians displaced across the Middle East. Tens of thousands of Afghan and Iraqi civilian deaths. Thousands of first responders, veterans, and contractors suffer from PTSD, traumatic brain injuries, and long-term health issues. The wars also left deep scars on public trust in institutions, government, and foreign policy. Bin Laden's death. A milestone. On May 2, 2011, nearly a decade after 9/11, U.S. Navy SEALs killed Osama bin Laden in a covert operation in Abbottabad, Pakistan. The raid, authorized by President Barack Obama, was a significant victory in the war on terror. Bin Laden had been hiding in plain sight near a Pakistani military academy, further straining U.S.-Pakistan relations. His death brought a sense of justice to many, but it did not end terrorism. Al-Qaeda survived. ISIS had already begun rising. The War on Terror, though it claimed its most infamous target, was far from over. A new global era, the War on Terror, reshaped the modern world. It changed the way nations defend themselves, how intelligence is gathered, how travelers move, how privacy is valued, and how cultures perceive one another. It exposed the vulnerabilities of even the most powerful nations, and it raised enduring questions about freedom, security, morality, and justice. Some call it a success for preventing another 9/11 style attack on American soil. Others view it as a cautionary tale of overreach, misdirection, and unintended consequences. What is certain is this: the world that emerged after 9/11 was fundamentally different from the one before. We'll delve into the controversies and conspiracy theories that followed the attacks, exploring the skepticism, distrust, and unanswered questions that continue to haunt public discourse. Conspiracies and controversies, unanswered questions. In the aftermath of the September 11 attacks, while the world was still grappling with grief and fear, another phenomenon began to emerge out. The sheer scale of the tragedy, the swiftness of the building's collapse, and the geopolitical consequences of the response all fueled suspicion. For some, the official narrative of what happened on 9/11 left gaps, contradictions, or unexplained details. Over time, a wide array of conspiracies and controversies took root, challenging the accepted story and raising deep questions about transparency, accountability, and truth. We'll explore the most persistent conspiracy theories, legitimate criticisms of the investigation, and the broader implications of public distrust after 9/11. The rise of the 9/11 Truth Movement. In the years following the attacks, an informal but vocal group known as the 9/11 Truth Movement began to gain traction. United by skepticism of the official explanation, they proposed that elements of the US government may have known about or even been complicit in the attacks. The movement was amplified by independent documentaries, books, and websites. Films like Loose Change, released in 2005, reached millions of viewers online and questioned everything from the collapse of the towers to the identity of the hijackers. Though widely criticized by experts and debunked in mainstream media, the movement tapped into a larger trend: growing public distrust in government, fueled by the Iraq War, intelligence failures, and perceived secrecy. Tower collapses, controlled demolition theories. One of the most widespread conspiracy theories focuses on how the Twin Towers and later Building 7, WTC-7, collapsed. Claim: the buildings were brought down not by jet fuel and fire, but by controlled demolition using explosives. Why some believed it? The symmetrical, rapid collapse of both towers resembled planned demolitions. Witnesses claimed to have heard secondary explosions. Building 7, a nearby 47-story skyscraper, collapsed in the afternoon without being directly hit by a plane. Official response: the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, conducted a multi-year investigation concluding the towers collapsed due to structural damage from the plane impacts and fires, which weakened the steel support columns. WTC-7 collapsed due to prolonged fires ignited by debris from the North Tower, leading to failure of a critical column. No evidence of explosives was found. Experts in engineering and demolition overwhelmingly support the official explanation. However, the speed and style of the collapses continue to feed public skepticism. The Pentagon strike, plane, or missile. Claim: Flight 77 did not hit the Pentagon. Instead, it was struck by a missile or explosive device. Why some believed it? Initial photographs showed little plane debris outside the building. The impact hole appeared, to some, too small for a Boeing 757. Security footage was limited and blurry, fueling suspicion. Official response: investigations confirmed. Aircraft debris, including landing gear and fuselage, was recovered from the site. DNA of passengers and crew was matched and identified. Eyewitnesses described seeing a low-flying plane crash into the Pentagon. Black box flight data corroborated the flight's trajectory. Despite this evidence, the missile theory remains one of the most repeated myths. Flight 93. Was it shot down? Claim: United Airlines Flight 93, which crashed in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, was shot down by the US military to prevent it from reaching its target. Why some believed it? The debris field was spread over several miles, suggesting mid-air breakup. The government initially gave conflicting statements about whether jets had been dispatched. Some officials suggested the plane was downed before confirming it crashed due to passenger intervention. Official response: the 9/11 Commission report concluded passengers attempted to retake the cockpit and the hijackers intentionally crashed the plane. The military had scrambled jets, but none were in position to intercept Flight 93 in time. Cockpit voice recordings confirmed the struggle and deliberate dive. Debris dispersion was consistent with a high-speed impact, not an aerial shootdown. Foreknowledge and financial activity. Another area of controversy centers around unusual financial transactions in the days leading up to 9/11. Claim: individuals with prior knowledge of the attacks engaged in put options bets that airline stocks would fall profiting from the tragedy. Why some believed it. Trading activity for United and American Airlines increased significantly before 9/11. The volume and timing seemed too coincidental. Official response: investigations by the SEC and CIA found that most suspicious trades were traceable to individuals with no connection to terrorism, such as institutional investors hedging positions. Still, the perception of possible insider knowledge continues to fuel suspicion among conspiracy theorists. Cheney, NORAD, and the war games. On the morning of 9/11, multiple military exercises were underway, including simulations of hijacked aircraft. Some have questioned whether these drills confused NORAD's response, allowing the real attacks to succeed. Further, critics have pointed to Vice President Dick Cheney's role in issuing orders from the Presidential Emergency Operations Center, PEOC, raising questions about command decisions during the crucial moments. The 9/11 Commission addressed these concerns, stating the exercises did cause some initial confusion, but did not significantly delay the response. Still, the convergence of real attacks and simulations sparked enduring debate. Criticism of the 9/11 Commission. The 9/11 Commission, established in 2002 and publishing its final report in 2004, was tasked with providing a full account of the events leading to and during the attacks. While praised for its thorough narrative and bipartisan cooperation, it faced criticism on several fronts. Delayed formation. The Bush administration initially resisted creating the commission. Limited access. Some intelligence agencies were reluctant to share documents. Omissions. Certain key figures and events were left unexamined or summarized briefly. No accountability. The report emphasized institutional failure, but did not assign blame. Family members of victims, especially the Jersey Girls, a group of 9/11 widows who pushed for the commission, voiced frustration over unanswered questions. Why conspiracies persist. Even with mountains of evidence, expert testimony, and investigations, conspiracy theories persist. Why? Trauma and disbelief. The enormity of 9/11 is difficult to process. For many, it's easier to believe in a complex conspiracy than in catastrophic failure. Mistrust in government. Events like the Iraq War, NSA surveillance leaks, and political scandals have eroded public faith in institutions. Internet amplification. Online platforms allow misinformation to spread rapidly and reach wide audiences. Lack of closure. Many families never recovered remains. Some questions, especially about intelligence failures, remain unresolved. Skepticism is a healthy part of democratic discourse, but conspiracy theories, when based on misinformation, can distort truth, disrespect victims, and divert focus from real accountability. A legacy of questions. The September 11 attacks changed the world, but they also opened a Pandora's box of speculation. While the official narrative is supported by extensive evidence and investigation, the shadow of doubt remains for some. In democratic societies, questioning authority is a fundamental right. But when doubt becomes dogma and theory replaces fact, it can fracture collective memory. What is clear is that 9/11 left scars deeper than buildings, and Bodysit shook the very idea of certainty. It challenged us to ask hard questions, to demand transparency, to seek truth while honoring the complexity of tragedy. Looking to the future, exploring how the world has rebuilt, remembered, and redefined itself in the decades since that fateful day. Legacy of 9/11. memory, resilience, and rebuilding. September 11, 2001 changed the world in an instant, but its influence continues to shape our reality decades later. Beyond the wreckage, the wars, and the sorrow, the legacy of 9/11 is found in how the world responded. It lives in the memorials, the legislation, the rebuilt towers, and most of all, in the memory of the people who were lost and those who lived on. The pain of that day has not faded, but neither has the determination to honor its meaning. We will explore how nations, families, survivors, and communities carried the memory of 9/11 forward, transforming devastation into resilience, remembrance, and renewal. Rebuilding Ground Zero. In the years following the attacks, one of the most emotional and symbolic tasks facing the United States was the reconstruction of Ground Zero. The site that once held the Twin Towers became sacred ground, part graveyard, part national monument. In 2006, after extensive public debate, architectural planning, and delays, construction began on a new complex that would come to embody both remembrance and renewal. One World Trade Center, also known as Freedom Tower. One World Trade Center was completed in 2013 and opened to the public in 2014. At 776 feet tall, symbolic reference to the year of American independence site, is now the tallest building in the Western Hemisphere. Its design emphasizes strength, simplicity, and light. At night, it glows against the New York skyline, standing as a proud counterpoint to the darkness of 9/11. The National September 11 Memorial. Opened on the 10th anniversary of the attacks in 2011, the memorial features two massive reflecting pools that sit in the footprints of the original Twin Towers. Around the pools, bronze panels bear the names of the 977 victims of 9/11, as well as those lost in the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. Waterfalls cascade into the void, symbolizing loss, but also continuity. Visitors run their fingers across names, leave flowers, notes, and American flags. The memorial is a space of quiet reflection in the heart of a bustling city. The 9/11 Museum. Beneath the memorial lies the 9/11 Memorial Museum, a powerful, immersive experience built into the foundations of the towers. It houses twisted steel beams, personal artifacts, voice recordings, and video footage that document the attacks and their aftermath. The museum tells not just the story of what happened, but how people lived, responded, and rebuilt. It reminds visitors that while the towers fell, the spirit of the people did not. The Pentagon Memorial. At the site where American Airlines Flight 77 struck the Pentagon, a permanent memorial was opened in 2008. The Pentagon Memorial consists of 184 illuminated benches, each dedicated to a victim of the attack, ranging in age from 3 to 71 years old. The benches are arranged by birth year and positioned to indicate whether the individual was on the plane or in the building. The design is simple but deeply symbolic, offering a quiet space for reflection and connection. Flight 93 National Memorial. In Shanksville, Pennsylvania, a remote field has become a place of national remembrance. The Flight 93 National Memorial, opened in 2015, honors the 40 passengers and crew who fought back against the hijackers, preventing an even greater tragedy. A wall of names, a visitor center, and a tower of voices containing 40 wind chimes stand as tributes to the bravery and sacrifice of those aboard. Their courage is not just commemorated, it is celebrated as an example of what ordinary people can do in the face of evil. The families and the grieving. For the families of the victims, 9/11 is not a historical event, it is a personal loss that echoes every day. Thousands of children grew up without parents, spouses never returned home, siblings vanished in an instant. In the years that followed, family members created foundations, scholarship funds, advocacy groups, and support networks. Organizations like Voices of September 11th, Tuesday's Children, and the Families of Freedom Scholarship Fund have helped survivors and children move forward while honoring the memory of their loved ones. Many family members became activists demanding accountability, pushing for better emergency response protocols, supporting mental health care for first responders, and advocating for justice on a global scale. First responders and the long-term toll. The heroism of the first responders on 9/11 came at a terrible cost. In the years after the attacks, thousands of firefighters, police officers, and recovery workers developed serious health problems due to exposure to toxic dust and debris at Ground Zero. Illnesses included respiratory disease, cancer, autoimmune disorders, and mental health issues like PTSD. As the health crisis unfolded, a second battle began, this time for medical care and financial compensation. The Zadroga Act, passed in 2010 and reauthorized in 2015 and 2019, provided long-term health benefits to 9/11 responders and survivors. It was a hard-fought victory, made possible by persistent advocacy and public pressure. But for many responders and their families, the battle continues. Each year, more names are added to the list of those who died due to 9/11 related illness, reminders that the legacy of 9/11 lives on in the bodies and minds of those who served. Education and memory. As time passes, fewer people remember where they were on September 11, 2001. A generation has grown up with no memory of that day, only what they've been taught. Across the United States, schools incorporate 9/11 education into history and civics classes. Documentaries, books, and museum programs aim to preserve the memory for future generations. The message is clear: never forget. But remembering isn't just about facts. It's about understanding the emotional, moral, and human dimensions of the tragedy, empathy, resilience, and the choices people made in extraordinary circumstances. A changed world. The post-9/11 era saw dramatic shifts in global politics, civil liberties, surveillance, and public perception of terrorism. Airport security changed permanently. Intelligence agencies expanded their powers. Debates about privacy, profiling, and immigration intensified. The war in Afghanistan ended in 200 and 2000, 120 years after it began, with the Taliban returning to power. For many, it raised painful questions. What was gained? What was lost? Was it worth it? Yet the deeper legacy of 9/11 may be in how it forced people to confront vulnerability and in how they responded with courage. A legacy of resilience. Despite the pain, the world did not remain in ruins. The cities rebuilt. The families adapted. The stories of heroism and humanity continue to inspire. The legacy of 9/11 is not just etched in marble or steel. It's found in firefighters who ran into danger, passengers who fought back, neighbors who opened their doors, and strangers who became family. It lives on in the silence of the reflecting pools, the wind chimes in a Pennsylvania field, and the words, "Let's roll," that still echo with defiance and bravery. Never forget. September 11 was a day of unspeakable horror, but also a day when the best of humanity shone through the worst. It shattered assumptions, changed nations, and left millions grieving. But it also revealed the strength of the human spirit. We remember the names, we remember the stories, we remember the lessons. And as the years pass, our duty is not only to mourn but to honor the legacy of those lost by how we live, how we protect one another, and how we choose unity over fear. Never forget. Let us not allow memory to fade into silence. If this video moved you, if the stories of courage, sacrifice, and resilience stirred something within, share it. Share it with your friends, your family, your community. Start conversations. Keep the memories of those we lost alive. We cannot change the past, but we can honor it by learning, reflecting, and choosing to build a more compassionate, united world. Leave a review. Start a discussion. Support organizations that aid survivors and first responders. Because remembering is not enough, we must act. Never forget. Never stop telling the story.